put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The vault that swallowed a nation. In the shadows of Eastern Europe, where fortunes are built on the ruins of collapsed empires, one man discovered that the fastest way to become a billionaire wasn't to build a business. It was to hollow out an entire nation's banking system from the inside. His name was Igor Kolomoisky, and by the time authorities realized what he'd done, $5.5 billion had already vanished into a labyrinth of shell companies stretching across 3 continents. This is the story of how a physicist turned privateer became Ukraine's most powerful oligarch by mastering a simple truth. In the chaos following the Soviet collapse, the biggest theft wasn't breaking into the vault, it was owning the bank itself. The year was 1991. The Soviet Union had just collapsed, leaving behind a power vacuum that would swallow entire nations. While ordinary citizens scrambled to survive the economic apocalypse, Igor Kolomoisky saw something different in the rubble, opportunity written in blood and chaos. Born in 1963 in Soviet Ukraine, Kolomoisky was a metallurgical engineer by training, a physicist by education. But his real genius wasn't in metals or mathematics. It was in understanding that in a lawless transition economy, the only rule was that there were no rules. While his peers debated market theory, Kolomoisky was already moving, already taking, already building an empire on the bones of a dying superpower. His first fortune came through Private Group, an industrial conglomerate he co-founded that devoured Soviet-era assets during the privatization frenzy. Factories, oil refineries, transportation networks. Everything that wasn't nailed down became part of his growing empire. And in Ukraine's Wild East, even things that were nailed down could be pried loose with the right connections and the right amount of force. But Kolomoisky understood something that separated him from other oligarchs scrambling for industrial scraps. Real power didn't come from owning factories. Real power came from owning the money itself. In 2004, Kolomoisky and his business partner, Gennady Bogolyubov, acquired control of Private Bank, a regional Ukrainian financial institution that would become the centerpiece of the most audacious banking fraud in European history. What happened next would make Lehman Brothers look like a college prank. Within years, Private Bank grew to become Ukraine's largest commercial bank, controlling nearly a third of all individual deposits in the country. Ordinary Ukrainians, teachers, nurses, pensioners, trusted Private Bank with their life savings. They saw the gleaming branches, the modern marketing, the promise of stability in an unstable world. They had no idea they were depositing their money into a sophisticated theft machine. Behind the respectable facade, Kolomoisky had transformed Private Bank into his personal piggy bank. Through a web of shell companies, over 600 of them registered in places like Cyprus, the British Virgin Islands, and Delaware. He funneled depositor money into his own businesses. The scheme was breathtakingly simple in concept, diabolically complex in execution. Private Bank would issue massive loans to companies that existed only on paper. These phantom entities would then transfer the money to other shell companies controlled by Kolomoisky and his associates. The loans would never be repaid because the borrowers were never real to begin with. It was financial alchemy, turning depositor savings into oligarch wealth through the dark magic of corporate structure and regulatory blindness. But Kolomoisky wasn't just a thief in a suit. He was a power broker who understood that in Ukraine, political protection was as valuable as money itself. During the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution and the subsequent war with Russian-backed separatists, Kolomoisky positioned himself as a patriot and defender of Ukrainian sovereignty. As governor of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, he personally funded volunteer battalions fighting in the east, earning him a reputation as a nationalist hero willing to spend his own fortune to defend the country. It was perfect political theater. While he played the role of patriot on the public stage, behind closed doors, he was systematically looting the very financial system that kept Ukraine's economy functioning. His media empire, including Ukraine's most popular television channel, ensured favorable coverage and protected his reputation. His political connections reached the highest levels of government. When a comedian named Volodymyr Zelensky started appearing on Kolomoisky's TV network, few could have predicted that this relationship would eventually reshape Ukrainian politics entirely. Zelensky's show Servant of the People, about a teacher who becomes president, aired on Kolomoisky's 1+1 channel. When fiction became reality, and Zelensky ran for president in 2019, the Oligarch's media machine was there to amplify his message. Kolomoisky had done what every oligarch dreams of. He'd become too powerful to touch, too connected to prosecute, too valuable to sacrifice. Or so he thought. In December 2016, Ukrainian authorities made a discovery that would crack open the entire scheme. Private Bank wasn't just troubled, it was essentially insolvent, hollowed out from the inside like a termite-infested mansion, with a fresh coat of paint. The central bank's investigation revealed a financial crime scene of staggering proportions. Nearly 97% of Private Bank's corporate loan portfolio, approximately $5.5 billion, had been lent to companies connected to the bank's own shareholders. $5.5 billion. To put that in perspective, that's more than the annual GDP of some small nations. It represented roughly 5% of Ukraine's entire economy, vanished into a maze of shell companies controlled by Kolomoisky and his associates. The Ukrainian government faced an impossible choice: let the bank collapse and trigger a financial catastrophe that would destroy public confidence in the entire banking system, or nationalize it and absorb the massive losses onto the government's balance sheet. They chose nationalization. In what became the largest banking rescue in Ukrainian history, the government seized Private Bank, pumped in billions to prevent total collapse, and effectively transferred Kolomoisky's theft onto the backs of Ukrainian taxpayers. The pensioners and workers who had deposited their savings would be protected, but only because their fellow citizens would now pay for the oligarch's crimes through their taxes. It was the perfect crime made even more perfect. Kolomoisky had stolen billions, and the government had to pay for it to prevent economic apocalypse. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath of nationalization. The walls of political protection that had surrounded Kolomoisky for decades began to show cracks. As Ukrainian investigators dug deeper into Private Bank's corpse, they uncovered something that transformed this from a domestic scandal into an international criminal conspiracy. The stolen billions hadn't stayed in Ukraine. Through an intricate network of offshore companies, Kolomoisky and his associates had moved the money across the globe, purchasing real estate in London, factories in the American Midwest, and commercial properties throughout Europe. In the United States alone, court documents would later reveal that Kolomoisky allegedly laundered money through a stunning array of American assets: steel mills in West Virginia and Kentucky, commercial properties in Cleveland and Dallas, even a Motorola radio factory. The scheme demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of global finance that rivaled any Wall Street operation. Money would flow from Private Bank to a shell company in Cyprus, then to another entity in the British Virgin Islands, before finally landing in a Delaware corporation that would purchase American real estate or businesses. Each layer made the money harder to trace. Each jurisdiction made prosecution more complex. It was financial engineering at its darkest, a masterclass in how to steal from the poor in one country and transform those stolen funds into legitimate-looking assets in another. Kolomoisky, of course, denied everything. In interviews, he painted himself as a victim of political persecution, a successful businessman targeted by enemies who wanted to steal his life's work. The nationalization of Private Bank, he claimed, was an illegal seizure, a politically motivated attack by rivals who wanted to destroy him. His lawyers filed lawsuits challenging the nationalization in Ukrainian courts in London, in international arbitration tribunals. If he couldn't keep the bank, he would at least tie up the government in legal battles for years, bleeding them dry through litigation. It was a strategy that had worked for decades: deny, delay, deploy legal armies, and wait for political winds to shift in his favor. But this time, something was different. By 2019, the international community had had enough. The United States revoked Kolomoisky's visa, barring him from entering the country due to significant corruption. It was a diplomatic grenade. The U.S. doesn't publicly label foreign nationals as corrupt unless they're ready to back it up with action. Then came the real bombshell. In 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a civil forfeiture complaint seeking to seize approximately $600 million worth of assets in the United States, allegedly purchased with money stolen from Private Bank. The complaint laid out in meticulous detail how Kolomoisky and his partner had allegedly used American banks and shell companies to launder money from Ukraine into the American heartland. Steel mills, office buildings, factories, all of it allegedly bought with money that belonged to Ukrainian depositors. But the Americans weren't done. In 2022, federal prosecutors in Miami took the extraordinary step of issuing a criminal indictment against Kolomoisky and Bogolyubov, charging them with wire fraud, money laundering conspiracy, and falsifying records. The indictment alleged a scheme spanning years, involving dozens of shell companies and hundreds of millions of dollars. For an oligarch who had spent decades operating with impunity, the message was clear. The game had changed. Perhaps most surprising was what happened in Ukraine itself. Volodymyr Zelensky, the comedian-turned-president who had once appeared on Kolomoisky's television network, did something that shocked observers. He didn't protect the oligarch. Whether due to international pressure, genuine reform impulses, or political calculation, Zelensky's administration began implementing anti-oligarch legislation designed to curtail the power of Ukraine's billionaire kingmakers. In September 2023, Ukrainian authorities arrested Kolomoisky on charges of fraud and money laundering. The man who had once been untouchable, who had funded armies and made presidents, was placed in pre-trial detention. The images were surreal. One of Ukraine's most powerful oligarchs, architect of a multi-billion-dollar banking fraud, finally facing Ukrainian justice. But even in detention, questions lingered. Would Ukraine's notoriously corrupt judicial system actually deliver justice? Or was this merely political theater, a show trial designed to satisfy international donors, while the real power structures remained intact? To understand the true scale of what Kolomoisky accomplished, you have to understand the mechanics of related party lending, one of the oldest tricks in the financial fraud playbook, executed here with breathtaking sophistication. A normal bank makes money by taking deposits from customers and lending that money to creditworthy borrowers at interest. The borrowers pay back the loans with interest, the bank keeps the spread, and depositors get their money back with a small return. It's the fundamental engine of modern banking. But what if you own the bank? What if, instead of lending to creditworthy borrowers, you lend to companies you secretly control? You approve the loans, you receive the money, and you never pay it back. From the outside, the bank's balance sheet looks fine. Loans have been issued, assets recorded. But the loans are worthless because the borrower is you, and you have no intention of repaying. This is exactly what investigators allege Kolomoisky did, but on a staggering scale and with layers of complexity designed to make detection nearly impossible. Company A, registered in Cyprus and controlled by Kolomoisky's associates, would borrow money from private bank. That money would immediately be transferred to Company B in the British Virgin Islands, which would transfer it to Company C in Delaware, which would finally use it to purchase real American assets, factories, real estate, businesses. The loan from private bank would never be repaid, but that didn't matter. The money had been successfully laundered through multiple jurisdictions and transformed into tangible assets that could generate real revenue. Ukrainian pensioners' savings had become Midwestern steel mills. Teachers' deposits had become Cleveland office buildings. Nurses' nest eggs had become factories and commercial real estate across America. It was theft through transmutation, the dark alchemy of modern finance. But the real story of Igor Kolomoisky isn't just about one man's greed or even one spectacular fraud. It's about the cost of oligarchy itself, the price entire nations pay when concentrated wealth translates into concentrated power. In the 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed, Western advisors promised that rapid privatization would create a class of entrepreneurs who would drive economic growth and democratic development. What actually emerged was a small group of oligarchs who captured state assets, corrupted institutions, and turned entire economies into personal fiefdoms. Kolomoisky was the perfect embodiment of this system. Brilliant, ruthless, and utterly immoral, he understood that in the post-Soviet space, the law was something you bought, not something you followed. His media empire controlled public opinion. His political connections protected him from prosecution. His financial resources allowed him to hire the best lawyers, the best PR firms, the best political consultants. For years, he was functionally above the law, not because the law didn't apply to him, but because he had the power to ensure it wouldn't be enforced. The private bank fraud succeeded not because it was particularly clever, but because Ukraine's institutional framework was too weak, too corrupt, and too compromised to stop it. Regulators who should have detected the fraud were either incompetent, corrupted, or terrified of the consequences of confronting a man with Kolomoisky's power. There are lessons here, though they're written in shadows and sealed in the vaults of hollowed-out banks. First, regulatory capture is the oligarch's best friend. When the people who are supposed to enforce the rules are either controlled by or afraid of the people breaking them, no amount of laws on paper matters. Kolomoisky didn't defeat Ukrainian banking regulation through superior intelligence. He defeated it through superior power. Second, complexity is camouflage. The web of 600-plus shell companies across multiple jurisdictions wasn't just about hiding money. It was about making the crime so complicated that investigation became nearly impossible. Each corporate layer, each jurisdiction, each legal entity added months or years to any potential prosecution. Third, in weak institutions, political protection trumps legal exposure. Kolomoisky operated with impunity not because his crimes were hidden, but because he had made himself valuable to powerful people. Only when that political protection eroded did the legal consequences finally arrive. Fourth, the banking system's fundamental vulnerability is trust. Private banks' depositors believed their money was safe because the alternative, that their country's largest bank was a criminal enterprise, was too frightening to contemplate. That trust, when betrayed, doesn't just harm individuals, it poisons the entire financial system for generations. The Kolomoisky case also revealed something crucial about the global financial system's ability to facilitate massive fraud. American banks processed the transactions. Delaware registered the shell companies. British Virgin Islands provided the opacity. Cyprus offered the banking secrecy. Each jurisdiction played its part in transforming stolen Ukrainian money into legitimate-looking American assets, and each could claim plausible deniability. We were just processing legal transactions, registering legal entities, providing legal banking services. The U.S. civil forfeiture complaint revealed just how deeply embedded this money had become in the American economy. Those steel mills in Kentucky and West Virginia employed real American workers. Those office buildings in Cleveland had real American tenants. Kleptocracy, it turns out, doesn't respect borders. It flows wherever the financial plumbing allows it to flow, mixing dirty money with clean until the distinction becomes meaningless. As of now, Kolomoisky's ultimate fate remains uncertain. He sits in Ukrainian detention, facing multiple criminal charges. American prosecutors have indicted him, though extradition seems unlikely. His assets remain frozen in multiple jurisdictions, the subject of complex legal battles that will drag on for years. But here's the darkest truth. Even if Kolomoisky is convicted, even if he spends the rest of his life in prison, the system that enabled him remains largely intact. The offshore financial infrastructure that allowed him to move billions still operates. The weak regulatory frameworks that failed to detect the fraud still exist. The political systems that protected oligarchs for decades are only beginning to be reformed. And the $5.5 billion, much of it is gone forever, dissipated across the global financial system, transformed into assets that have been sold and resold, moved and hidden, until tracing it becomes an exercise in futility. The Ukrainian taxpayers who had to bail out Private Bank will never be made whole. The depositors whose trust was betrayed will never fully trust their banking system again. The damage to Ukraine's financial credibility will take decades to repair. Igor Kolomoisky's story is ultimately a story about power, how it's acquired, how it's maintained, and what happens when it's finally confronted. He rose from the chaos of Soviet collapse to build an empire that spanned industries and continents. He made politicians, funded armies, and controlled the flow of information through his media properties. For 2 decades, he operated at the peak of Ukrainian power, untouchable and seemingly eternal. But power built on theft is inherently unstable. It requires constant maintenance, constant protection, constant feeding. The moment the political winds shift, the moment international pressure becomes too intense to ignore, the whole structure can collapse with shocking speed. What remains is a cautionary tale about the cost of institutional weakness, the price of regulatory capture, and the long shadow that oligarchy casts over emerging democracies. In a vault somewhere in Ukraine, there are probably documents that detail exactly where every dollar went, records of every shell company, every wire transfer, every property purchase, a perfect map of how to steal a country's bank and get away with it for 20 years. But even if those documents exist, even if investigators eventually trace every missing dollar, they can't answer the deeper question that haunts this story. How many other Igor Kolomoiskys are out there right now? In how many other countries, running the same playbook, building their empires on the ruins of public trust? Because here's the truly terrifying thing about the private bank scandal. It only came to light because it became too big to hide. $5.5 billion is hard to conceal, even with 600 shell companies. But what about 4 billion? What about 3? What about the oligarchs who are smart enough, disciplined enough, or lucky enough to keep their thefts just below the threshold of international attention? The dark truth is that we'll never know. And somewhere tonight, in a luxury apartment in London or Miami or Monaco, another oligarch with another hollowed-out bank is reading about Kolomoisky's arrest and thinking, I won't make his mistakes. That's the real horror of this business story. Not that it happened, but that it's probably still happening. The vault is always open for those who know where to find the key. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.